to work in 2035, although we've kind of rehashed it a little bit to focus on the future of the commute, right? So Ben, I'm going to leave you in very capable hands, guys.
Thank you.
Right.
And contrary to what Artie may have told you this morning, I was not hungover. I was in the bar until 2 o'clock, but I'm fully functioning this morning, so delighted to see you all. Thank you very much. So while Lucy was talking about health and fitness, I'm going to talk about something entirely different, which is how we can just sit in cars and they'll drive us everywhere without even having to worry about who is driving. We're going to talk about the future of the commute, so everything from robo-taxis to hyperloops. What will the future of our commute look like? Because the future is not that far away. But what is realistic and what is just a pipe dream right now? To help me separate a little bit of fact from fiction as we look at the future of the commute, please welcome Jayesh Jagasia, who's a producer and host of AI in Automotive podcast. Welcome. Grab a seat. Nice to see you. How are you? You okay? Lots for us to talk about, and delighted that you are here to clarify a few things for me. And let's start first of all with where we are on the journey. How far are we away, first of all, from driverless vehicles? Is it achievable in the next decade, do you think?
I wish there was an easy, simple two-line answer, but there isn't. The reality is that driverless vehicles are already here.
Yep.
You may not see them because they may not be on our roads, but they're definitely operating in certain use cases that are more amenable to a driverless vehicle. So think ports, think mines, and these are use cases, warehouses, where you have driverless vehicles operating here and now today, right? But when it comes to more mainstream applications that you and I relate to, so is there going to be a driverless lorry on the road or a fleet of driverless robo-taxis? We are getting there. The journey may not be linear, the journey may not be smooth, but we'll get there. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that from a technology perspective, this problem will be solved. There have been some very interesting developments in the last few years in terms of the paradigms that companies are using to solve this problem. From a technology perspective, I anticipate in the next few years, you'll start to see more and more vehicles with more and more autonomous capabilities appearing on our roads.
And is the challenge, as always, trying to work out the mix? Because if you've got still human-controlled vehicles and robot vehicles, it's the two coming head-to-head that poses the problem, doesn't it? If we could say everything's automatic, everything's autonomous tomorrow, that would be a much simpler solution, wouldn't it?
Well, yes and no. I think there are 2 or 3 different dimensions to the autonomy problem. One is technology, which we spoke about, and the technology will evolve and it will get there. But there is an important cultural element to it, which goes to the point you're making, that this conflict or clash between piloted vehicles and autonomous vehicles. But more than the clash between the machines, it is the cultural aspect of us as a people, us as other road users, accepting and embracing autonomous vehicles. Yeah. So you would have read about the case in San Francisco where members of the public decided to fool around with an autonomous vehicle by putting cones on the hood of the car. Now these are all, we should be expecting stuff like this, because at the end of the day, it's a step change in technology, and that always causes a certain percentage of the population to feel nervous about. So there is a cultural aspect to it which needs to be solved, and then there is a regulatory and legal aspect. So there are still, for example, a lot of open points around insurance with autonomous vehicles, because there is a different manufacturer of the hardware, or there are multiple different manufacturers of the hardware. There is a different producer of the software, and so on and so forth. And in the case of an event, who is the one that the liability sits with is still an open question, and that is up to, that is a legal challenge. Then there are regulatory challenges. What sort of environments are we okay for autonomous vehicles to operate in? But most importantly, what sort of accident rate are we accepting of? Yeah. With human drivers, we are used to a certain rate of accidents, and we don't bat an eyelid, even if the accident is serious. But when a machine is driving itself, our expectations of how safe it should be are orders of magnitude higher. And then that's the sort of regulatory challenge that we're dealing with.
And it also speaks to how we will interact with these machines too. The way that it won't be about pressing buttons or asking it to do something. It's about our human relationship with a machine that will change our relationship with autonomy.
100%. So I find this very fascinating that we are in the future. If you look at from 10 years back, but we're still interacting with our machines using buttons and chimes and visual cues rather than something that is more intuitive to us, which is speaking, right? So how many of you speak to your car? Probably very few. How many of you speak to your phones? You know, you've got Siri on your phone. So if you had to call somebody, is your first instinct to pick up the phone, go to the phone app and look for the person's contact? Or do you say, call so-and-so? And I think, you know, at some point, we will start to see the interaction with our machines become more natural. And that's two-way, you know, your car interacting with you as well in human language rather than through, you know, 6 different types of chimes, which we are sitting and figuring out, oh, so is this chiming because somebody is not wearing a seatbelt or a door is not closed properly or I'm in the vicinity of something that I'm going to crash into. So I think, and again, this is something I believe very deeply in. Once you solve communication between humans and machines and make it more intuitive and more natural, that will dramatically transform our relationships with our vehicles and our cars. You know, the old adage, and especially in some parts of the world where people tend to get very attached with their cars and they start to think of their vehicles as extensions of their personalities. I mean, dial that up 100 times and you know, you might start to think of your car as your pet because you're now communicating with each other in a language that you understand. You might start people falling in love with their cars in a very different way than we have been used to for the last 100 years. So yes, absolutely.
One of my favorite things to do, by the way, is say the words like Alexa or Siri when I'm on the TV doing the J job, just to annoy people across the country when all the Alexas start going off at once. It makes me lots of friends. Talk to me as well about that relationship that we will have with our built environment as a result of this sort of technology, because it strikes me that so much changes. If, for example, you can summon that driverless vehicle to pick you up, to take you to work, you don't need to worry about a driveway. You don't need to worry about big car parks that need access. You can hand over more of city centres to parks and greenery instead of, you know, car parks and multi-stories. That's just the kind of the vehicle thing. The way we will plan cities, the way we will plan where we can live to get to the office. Could I live in London and go to Manchester in a driverless car, sleep in the car on the way? All of that sort of stuff suddenly changes how we relate to the built environment, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 things. One, if you look at the history of how a majority of urban centers evolved and they grew from being quite small, because research that goes back decades and centuries says that your living space and the size of the living space is determined by the duration of your commute. And for decades now, and for centuries now, the average commute time of 30 minutes is what most people are willing to live with, and that determines how big your urban space is. So when we went from walking to horse carriages is when our cities expanded dramatically. And then there was another step change when we went from horse carriages to automobiles, and that, you know, exploded our city spaces. And now we have these large suburban areas, and we have Chicagoland and Detroitland and so on and so forth. I think what we are probably at the cusp of is another dramatic explosion when stuff like this, and I'm not limiting myself to autonomous vehicles, but also think about eVTOLs, right? Vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, which democratize short duration flight. And suddenly now you're thinking of a very different 30-minute commute, which means your urban areas in terms of their size expand dramatically. Your relationship with the spaces that you inhabit and occupy, it changes dramatically. And then of course there's the point that you're making of, in our existing urban areas, there are spaces dedicated to things that we may not need 5, 7, 8, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
And this is again a change that has already started to happen in American cities, which have traditionally not invested in public transportation, and individuals are very reliant on personal transportation to get from point A to point B. Needless to say, there are huge parking spaces, there are parking garages, there are rooftops of buildings with parking for thousands of cars. As things change, there are certain cities that have invested in improving their public transportation infrastructure. With work from home and commutes reducing, there just isn't as much need for thousands of car parking spots. What cities like Detroit have started to do very interestingly is transform some of those large parking lots into urban farms, for instance. So they're actually growing fruit and vegetable and selling it in the market, and they've turned that into a very, very meaningful, interesting commercial opportunity.
And things like solar parks and that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
Our time is up, but I want us to kind of spin forward a little bit, and we've talked here about what we already know, what is within our realms of possibility, however far away it is. What are we not talking about? Where should we be looking in other fields, in other industries, that we can learn lessons?
I think there are two sort of conflicting schools of thought here. One is that a lot of the future is inspired by history. So you look into the past to learn more about what's coming next. And I would say, to all the funders and founders here, you want to be learning more about history and how our urban spaces evolved and how our vehicles have evolved to be what they are, to get some inspiration about what lies ahead. But there's a sort of conflicting school of thought that says, what got us to this point is not what's going to get us from this point forward. So, perhaps we sometimes tend to get into the habit of viewing the future from the lens that has allowed us to see the past, and probably that does not exist. There are advances in technology, in material science, which we don't know of today, but may make our future very different from how we imagine it today, looking at it from today's framework and from what we know. So I know it's a slightly philosophical answer, but to the funders and founders here, you want to be thinking about what's coming next that might dramatically alter the paradigm, and then within that landscape, what sort of opportunities exist for people like us.
And that very neatly gets us to where Lucy's talking next. We're talking space, going even bigger, out of this world. So, Jayesh, thank you so much. Really good to have you with us. Thank you. And I'll hand you over to Lucy. Thanks. We'll do a quick, very nice. We'll do a quick picture.